Hi, everybody. Tonight, let us drift together into the distant, dusky halls of medieval memory, where the glow of candlelight dances on stone walls and whispers echo through forgotten corridors. We shall journey into a realm where mystery slumbers beneath ivy-covered ruins and tangled legends, where riddles of the past remain unsolved, and stories trail off into silence. This is a tale unlike most, a tale woven from the morbid, strange, and inexplicable occurrences that once puzzled kings, monks, and villagers alike. In the mist-veiled centuries of the Middle Ages, before reason had fully lifted its lantern, there were moments, peculiar and chilling, left unanswered by history. And tonight, we begin with one such moment, delicately unraveled from the tapestry of time. Our journey will stretch across 22 evenings, and each night, I will gently offer you a piece of this puzzle, spoken softly as you rest, and let the shadows carry you toward sleep. So, nestle in as we begin with part 1, where a silent abbey holds a secret too deep for the grave. The year was 1293. The summer had lingered long that year, the air still heavy with warmth even into September, when most harvests were already being brought to the barns. In a secluded corner of what is now northern France, nestled within the tangled woods of Picardy, stood the Abbey of Saint Avel, an isolated monastic retreat devoted to the Benedictine rule and known for its strict silence and austere life. The abbey's stone was weathered gray, grown with slow lichens and ivy tendrils that wrapped around its ancient spine like memory itself. It was the kind of place that seemed to breathe with the forest around it, quietly, patiently waiting. Inside, monks moved like ghosts, cloaked in habits of wool, their chants echoing through cold corridors lined with icons and carved saints. Life passed simply there, in rhythm with prayer and contemplation. But in the early days of that September, something changed. It began, as these stories so often do, with a disappearance. Brother Adalric was the youngest of the monks, barely 23, brought to the order after a fever in his village left him shaken and unmoored from the world he once knew. He had taken to monastic life with a solemn kind of devotion, quiet, eager, and easily overlooked. But on the morning of the Feast of St. Giles, as the monks gathered for matins, Adalric's place was empty. At first it was assumed he had overslept or perhaps fallen ill. His cell was checked, his cot still made, a half-burnt candle by the windowsill, but no sign of the boy. The abbot ordered the grounds searched. Brothers wandered the orchard, the herb garden, even the dense paths winding through the forest beyond. Not a thread of his robe, not a footprint, nothing. Then, on the third day, something was found. In the cloister garden, under the yew tree where the monks often sat in quiet study, lay a small scrap of parchment. Its edges were scorched, and its center bore a single line, written in trembling hand. The bells rang, though no one pulled the rope. This cryptic message puzzled the monks deeply. The bells, they said, had not rung since Sunday, and no one could recall hearing them in the dead of night. But the parchment was undeniably Adalric's. His script was unmistakable. How it came to be in the garden or why it bore such an ominous line, none could explain. And then the dreams began. One by one, the monks began to murmur, at first in private confessions, then in hushed exchanges in the corridors, that they had seen him. Not awake, but in dreams. Brother Adalric walking barefoot along the cloister walk, eyes closed, mouth moving as if in silent prayer. Some claimed he was weeping. Others swore they had seen a shadow following him, tall and thin, never touching the ground. Brother Henry, the infirmarian, reported waking one night to find a trail of damp footprints leading across the stone floor outside his chamber. But when he followed them with a lamp, they vanished beneath the altar of the chapel, where no one was permitted to tread without the abbot's leave. At first, the abbot forbade further talk of dreams, declaring them the product of unease and overworked minds. But then came the second disappearance. Brother Simon, who had been one of the few who dared speak aloud of the shadows in his sleep, failed to appear for vespers. His cot was found cold, his sandals still by the door. The only clue was a single black feather left upon his pillow. No crows were kept at the abbey, nor had any flown overhead that day. The bells, again, were heard that night. Not loud, but soft, like a whispering peal far off in the hills. Only Brother Amar, who kept the chapel watch, was certain of it. He swore the sound came not from the bell tower, but from below, from deep within the earth, beneath the foundation stones of the abbey itself. Word began to spread beyond the abbey walls. A merchant passing through nearby Saint-Évreux brought news of the abbey's unease to the village priest, who in turn brought it to the bishop. Rumors trickled like cold water down the mountainside. Some spoke of a forgotten crypt beneath Saint-Yvel, sealed centuries ago after a terrible act of heresy. Others whispered that the monks had invited something in, that silence had bred secrets not meant for daylight. By the time the bishop arrived, flanked by 2 inquisitors and a trio of armed guards, 5 monks were missing, each disappearance as silent and trace-free as the last. The abbot, pale and trembling, insisted upon divine punishment and begged for prayers to cleanse the abbey. The bishop agreed, but he also ordered the cloisters searched. For 3 days, stone was lifted, roots dug through, and every corner of the ancient abbey was turned out under torchlight. They found something. Beneath the chapel, behind a crumbled section of wall in what had once been a burial crypt, was a chamber no one living to know of. Its entrance was sealed by a slab carved with strange symbols, unfamiliar, almost pagan. Beneath the dust, there were claw marks, not from beast or blade, but deep, desperate scratches, as if something had once tried to claw its way out or in. The slab was not moved. Not then. Not yet. The bishop declared a fast, and the monks were forbidden to sleep alone. But that very night, the final monk vanished. It was the abbot, and in his place, by the altar where he had always knelt, was left his robe, folded perfectly. And beneath it, that same single line, now written in red ink, "The bells rang though no one pulled the rope." To this day, the Abbey of Saint-Yvel stands, though it has long been abandoned. Locals avoid the grounds, and travelers report hearing bells when no wind stirs and no hand moves. The crypt was never opened, and Brother Adalric's face, young, pale, dreaming, has been seen in the windows when the moon is full. But no explanation has ever been found, only silence, and the ringing of bells that no one ever rings. Shall we continue next time with what the bishop found in the sealed scrolls of Saint-Yvel's archive? Let us sleep now with quiet hearts. The night is long, and the story has only just begun. The bishop remained at the abbey for 7 days after the abbot's vanishing, though not without trepidation. The air around Saint-Yvel had grown thick with something unnameable, an invisible weight pressing in on the breath and bone of every man who remained. The inquisitors slept little, each taking turns standing watch through the echoing hours between midnight and dawn. But nothing stirred, save the leaves and the mournful song of wind weaving through the cloisters. On the second morning, after a night of uneasy silence, the bishop called for the unlocking of the abbey's archive. There, behind a door bolted with iron and blessed in waxen crosses, lay centuries of parchment and vellum, sealed away from even the monks themselves. These were records from times when Saint-Yvel had not yet been a quiet place of solitude, but rather a fortress of conversion, built in blood and baptism. Among the dust-cloaked shelves, the bishop's scribes uncovered a series of scrolls bearing the seal of Prior Damasus, a name unfamiliar even to the oldest chroniclers. Dated nearly 200 years before the current year of 1293, these documents spoke of a tribunal held within the abbey's own walls, a secret heresy trial for one of their own. The accused, Brother Alric of Mainz, a foreign monk who had claimed visions granted by the archangel Cassio, and who reportedly heard music that no others could perceive. Music, he claimed, from the spheres beyond death. Brother Alric had composed what he called the Sanctum Harmonia, a piece of sacred music inscribed with symbols not of Latin, but a curling, dreamlike script that none could decipher. When sung, he claimed, the veil between the living and the dead grew thin enough to permit understanding or passage. The scrolls grew darker from there. Witnesses spoke of unearthly harmonics, of bells that rang in answer without touch, and of voices, hundreds, perhaps thousands, chanting beneath the abbey floor. The final scroll bore no date. It was written not by Damasus, but by an unnamed hand, hurried and smudged. It stated simply, "We have entombed him below. The music must not be sung. The slab must not be moved. The silence must be preserved. If you hear the bells, do not follow, do not answer, do not descend." The bishop, shaken but resolute, ordered the scrolls sealed once more. He left the abbey the following morning with his guards and inquisitors, taking the scrolls with him, leaving only a single priest, Father Renaud, to tend the grounds and pray for the souls of the vanished monks. But Father Renaud would not last the winter. His letters, preserved in the diocesan records, were erratic, at first hopeful, then anxious, and finally, near the end, unreadable for their frantic, broken script. He wrote of dreams where the abbey filled with pale figures, their mouths open in voiceless song, of a bell that rang with no clapper, of a child's voice beneath the chapel floor begging to be let out. His final letter, never sent, was found tucked beneath the altar stone. The silence has changed. It listens now. The bells are learning our names. After his disappearance, the abbey was declared cursed. No priest was sent in his stead. The woods reclaimed the paths. The cloisters grew dark, moss-laden, untouched. But still there were sightings. In 1336, a group of pilgrims passing through the region reported hearing hymns from within the abbey, though its windows were shattered and its doors barred. A century later, a knight returning from the north wrote in his journal that he saw a torchlight in the tower at St. Yvel, and a figure at the window watching him with eyes not made for this world. And always, the sound of bells. In 1442, a scribe named Marguerite of Rouen, traveling on assignment to record the forgotten monasteries of Picardy, braved the journey to the abbey ruins. Her account, now kept in the Bibliothèque Sainte-Marie, describes the interior as strangely preserved, despite centuries of abandonment. She claimed to have seen books in the scriptorium with pages still open, as if only moments ago disturbed. A chalice on the altar still held wine, unspoiled, and in the dust beside the choir pews, footprints. But no birds sang in the air above the abbey. No insects crawled on the stone. It was, she wrote, a place utterly removed from time. She stayed the night against the warnings of her escort. In the morning, she emerged white-haired and silent. She lived another 31 years, but never spoke again. Her journal from that night ends mid-sentence, and as I placed my hand upon the bell rope, I heard my name, softly, sweetly. The line breaks there. No ink follows. Some say the abbey stands to this day, hidden deep within forest paths, long forgotten by all but the oldest maps. Others say it has vanished entirely, swallowed by the earth that once cradled its foundation. But those who live near where St. Yvel once stood still speak of a sound on cold autumn nights, when the moon is high and the wind breathes low. A ringing, melancholy, beautiful, distant, a bell that no one dares answer. And now we begin to wonder, what was the true nature of Brother Ulrich's vision? Why was it buried, hidden, sealed for so long? In the next chapter, we shall follow the path of the scrolls, and how a young archivist centuries later dared to translate the music that once opened a doorway between worlds. But for now, rest as the bells toll only in dreams. Let sleep come gently, like moss on stone. The scrolls of St. Yvel were thought lost for nearly 2 centuries after the bishop carried them away from the cursed abbey. No record remained of where he had stored them, nor to whom he entrusted their preservation. It was as if the very act of reading them, of touching that forbidden parchment, had caused them to slip through the seams of time, quietly hidden from all who might be tempted to look again. And yet, in the year 1611, within the candlelit corridors of the Cathedral Library of Clermont, a sealed chest was discovered behind a crumbled section of wall. It was during a renovation when a mason's hammer fell against hollow stone, revealing a forgotten alcove. Inside that narrow space was a single box, wrapped in linen and bound with iron clasps. The sigil upon it was unmistakable to those who studied ecclesiastical seals, the mark of Bishop Etienne de Caen, the very man who had last touched the secrets of St. Yvel. The chest was turned over to the chief archivist, a man named Thibault Lemoyne, a scholar of gentle disposition and fading health. Thibault was in his early 40s, but carried the gait of one much older. He had spent his life among books and dust, and had come to speak more fluently with parchment than with people. Thibault opened the chest with care. Inside, preserved against time by the dry darkness, were the scrolls, the ink still bold, the vellum pliant. Each bore the same curling, anxious script described in ancient inventories. But there was something else as well, something no record had ever noted. Wrapped in a separate bundle, secured with a thread of red silk, was a single sheet of music. The notes were drawn not in the conventional notation of the Renaissance, but in a jagged, glyph-like system, as though written by a hand unsure whether it was drawing or writing. The page had no title, only a brief line in Latin at its head, Cantus Silentii, per audire transire. The Song of Silence, to hear is to cross. Thibaut, unlike the fearful bishops of old, was a man of curiosity before caution. He set about studying the page, unaware that he was brushing the edges of a mystery that had waited patiently beneath the skin of time. For nights, he pored over the scrolls, translating the Latin testimonies of monks long dead and slowly piecing together the tale of Brother Ulrich. He became convinced that the strange symbols were a form of notated glossolalia, a written attempt to transcribe the spiritual language Ulrich claimed to hear from celestial beings. To Thibaut, it was a linguistic marvel. He charted each symbol, sought patterns, counted intervals, and echoed phrases. By spring of that year, he had created a tentative transcription of the melody into modern notation. One evening, after Vespers, he took the parchment to the cathedral's cloister, where the acoustics were gentle and round. With the hush of dusk upon the stones, Thibaut began to hum the first bars of the Cantus Silentii. The effect was immediate. Though he sang alone, he heard harmony, distant but clear, unfolding beside and behind his voice, as though the walls themselves had memory and were now joining in. He stopped, heart pounding. Silence fell, and then, from somewhere behind the cloister, he heard footsteps. But no one appeared. Thibaut returned to his quarters shaken, yet drawn to the music even more. Over the following weeks, he sang it again, only ever a few notes at a time. Each time, the world around him changed ever so slightly. Shadows clung longer. Candles flickered against windless air. His dreams grew vivid, filled with unfamiliar faces mouthing silent words. He would awaken with the taste of metal on his tongue and a name in his mind, Adalric. It was then he made a decision that would mark the turning point in his quiet life. He wrote to a former pupil, a young composer named Alain de Précy, whose talents with choral arrangement had grown famed in Paris. Thibaut did not explain the full nature of the music, but claimed to have discovered a medieval sacred piece worthy of revival. He invited Alain to Clermont to hear it sung with full voice. Alain arrived in June, full of youthful enthusiasm and confidence. He found Thibaut pale, gaunt, but feverishly eager. That evening, by candlelight, the two of them worked to arrange the Cantus Silentii for 4 voices. Alain noted the strangeness of the intervals, how they seemed to pull toward dissonance, yet resolved with aching beauty. He called the piece haunting, angelic. The next morning, Thibaut was dead. There was no wound, no sign of illness. He was found in the cloister, his eyes wide open, lips parted in what some said looked like mid-song. The scrolls were untouched. But the sheet of music was gone. Alain, distraught and confused, left Clermont with the transcription he had helped complete. He returned to Paris, where he sought to refine the piece into a form he could debut. Though he spoke little of Thibaut's death, he could not shake a feeling of being watched, of hearing faint notes in the air at odd hours, just outside his hearing. In September of that year, he premiered a portion of the cantus at a private gathering in the salon of the Duchess de Marcy. He titled it La Messe du Silence. The quartet sang it in full. Those who attended later claimed the air had thickened in the room, that a kind of reverent dread had filled them as the voices wove through the melody. Several were seen weeping without understanding why. One woman fainted. A servant claimed he heard the name Adalric whispered in his ear, though no one near him had spoken. Within a week, 3 of the singers were dead, each of what doctors called sudden cardiac failure. Alain vanished. The only clue he left behind was a journal, its final entry marked with the same line once found in the Abbey of Saint-Yvel. The bells rang, though no one pulled the rope. The music was never performed again. The manuscript Alain had composed disappeared, believed destroyed in a fire that consumed the Duchess's estate during the Fronde. But rumors persisted that a copy survived, hidden in some remote monastery or locked within a private collection under threat of curse. Those who have sought it have often gone missing. The Cantus Silentii has earned a new name among those who dare speak of it. The song that opens. And what, we must wonder now, does it open? A door? A memory? A place where silence is not absence, but invitation? In our next chapter, we shall trace the path of a 19th century antiquarian who claimed to hear the song once again. hidden in an old recording, captured accidentally by a phonograph not meant to record the past. But tonight, may your sleep be untouched by distant harmonies. Let the bells remain still. Let silence keep it secret, just a little longer. In the year 1883, among the winding alleys of Blois, an aging antiquarian named Julien Favreau lived alone above a narrow shop lined with the flotsam of forgotten ages. His establishment, Les Echos du Temps, was known for its peculiar inventory: dust-choked tomes, cracked daguerreotypes, warbled sheet music, and instruments out of tune with the modern world. Favreau himself was equally peculiar, gaunt, bespectacled, and dressed always in heavy woolen coats no matter the season, as though the chill of history clung to his bones. Favreau's passion lay in the sounds of the past. Where others collected letters or relics, he sought echoes, recordings from the earliest phonographs, wax cylinders and tinfoil reels, the crude beginnings of an art not yet understood. He believed that voices once captured held fragments of memory, and that in their distortions, one might find what history had chosen to forget. It was in the late autumn of that year that a man came into his shop carrying a case of phonograph cylinders wrapped in oilcloth. The man gave no name and spoke in a voice dry and unfamiliar. He claimed to have found the recordings in the attic of a defunct priory near Saint-Mihiel, hidden behind a false wall along with a journal and a crucifix wrapped in red ribbon. Favreau offered a modest sum for the collection, and the man left without another word. Among the usual crackles and hymns of peasant choirs, one cylinder stood apart. Its surface was marked only with a single word: Cantique. No author, no date. Favreau placed it on his phonograph that very evening, setting the needle with trembling hands. The first sound was silence, hissing, expectant, almost warm. Then a tone, low, long, like a bell far beneath the ground, followed by a voice. The voice sang alone at first, breathy and strange, then layered unexpectedly, as though joined by others, though no recording device of that era could permit such complexity. The harmonies spiraled, dissonant and sweet, until the melody reached a point where, according to Favreau's later notes, something turned inside the air. He stopped the machine, not out of fear, but confusion. The room around him had grown dim, though his lamp still burned. The shadows had thickened. The walls seemed farther apart or nearer. He could not decide. He heard no bells, but his ears rang with a sound not entirely external. That night, his dreams returned to him with a vividness he had not known since boyhood. He walked through a forest without sky, guided by a song that seemed always just ahead. He came upon an abbey of stone blackened by time, its tower rising crooked through a fog that held the light like stained glass. And always, the same music, woven like breath through the air. He woke with a name in his mind: Saint Yvel. In the days that followed, Favreau became consumed. He played the cylinder again and again, transcribing the melody, comparing it to medieval modal structures, Gregorian chants, even esoteric Sufi tonalities. But it matched none exactly. He wrote letters to fellow musicologists, asking whether such a composition had ever been catalogued. One responded, a Madame Lucille Jourdan, a choral scholar in Poitiers. She had heard of such a melody, she said, or rather, she had read of it. A tale from the 17th century told of a bishop's archivist who had reconstructed a song from lost scrolls, one that, when sung, summoned voices that had no source. She enclosed a copy of a page from an obscure clerical memoir. The text was familiar to Favreau. It was the same phrase he had read of years before, in an unrelated volume. The bells rang, though. No one pulled the rope. With mounting dread, Favreau retrieved a leather-bound book from the back of his shelves, a compendium of suppressed ecclesiastical trials. In its faded index, the name reappeared: Brother Ulrich of Mainz, condemned in the year 1107 for heresy through song. He had thought it coincidence. Now he knew otherwise. Julien Favreau began to speak less and write more. His journal, preserved today in the Musée d'Histoire de la Musique, reads as a descent into obsession. He mapped the song's intervals like constellations. He drew the abbey from his dreams in increasing detail. Corridors he had never seen, statues whose names he somehow knew. He began to hear the music without the machine, especially in twilight hours when sleep came slow. On the 21st night of listening, something changed. He played the recording at half speed, as was his custom, to study its deeper resonances. But this time, the needle skipped. A new sound emerged, brief, broken, almost speech. Favreau lifted the stylus and played it again. The fragment repeated, "Renaud, help me." He froze. The name stirred memory. A monk, Father Renaud, the last to remain at Saint-Devel before its final abandonment. His letter, thought apocryphal, had ended with that chilling line, "The bells are learning our names." Favreau's health began to falter. He developed a tremor in his hands, and black circles bloomed under his eyes. He refused visitors. When neighbors peered through his window, they reported hearing faint music even when the phonograph was not running. One child claimed to see figures moving inside the shop, tall, hooded, silent. On the final night of his life, Favreau recorded one last message onto a cylinder of his own. It remains today, cracked, partially degraded, but its opening words are preserved. I know now that it is not merely a song, but a key, a call, or perhaps an answer. The rope does not need to be pulled because the bell is inside us. We ring it every time we remember. Julien Favreau was found seated beside his machine, eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. No signs of distress, no evidence of struggle, only a single sheet of paper on his desk, with a phrase written over and over again in a looping, almost childlike script. Adalric. The cylinder labeled Cantique vanished shortly after his death. Some believe it was taken by a scholar from Vienna. Others say it never existed at all. But occasionally, in sound archives across Europe, technicians report picking up faint echoes on old reels, melodies that should not be there, voices layered in impossible harmonics, and the sound of a bell tolling gently beneath it all. Next, we shall step away from Europe and follow the melody as it surfaced in the most unlikely of places, within the sandstone canyons of 20th century Palestine, where a fragment of the chant was etched not on parchment, but into stone. But for now, rest. Do not hum. Let silence keep you, and the bells remain still. In the spring of 1931, under a white sky swollen with heat, an archaeological expedition unearthed something peculiar in the southern reaches of the Judean desert. Led by Dr. Elias Mehran, a scholar of early Christian mysticism from the University of Oxford, the team had been excavating the remains of a remote monastery believed to date back to the 6th century. The site, perched in a narrow ravine where wind whispered through sun-bleached rock, was thought to be one of the many refuges built by Syriac monks who fled persecution and wandered into the wilderness to live in ascetic devotion. The monastery was humble in design, stone cells carved into the canyon's sides, a small chapel with a collapsed apse, and the faint remnants of frescoes long faded to the color of dust. But beneath the chapel's cracked foundation, hidden within a natural crevice sealed by centuries of sediment, the team uncovered a chamber. Inside, undisturbed, lay a stone tablet unlike any other known to the region. It was black, a deep, glassy basalt, and strangely warm to the touch, as though it retained some quiet pulse. Its surface bore no images, but instead a series of marks, symbols, carefully etched and arranged into staves. Not words, not letters. Music. Dr. Myron, experienced in early Syriac and Greek inscriptions, was baffled. The symbols bore resemblance to neither pneumas nor the square notation used by monastic orders of the desert. They curled and spiraled in ways that seemed ornamental yet intentional. He photographed the tablet, made rubbings, and had it carefully lifted and packed for transport to Jerusalem. But that night, within the expedition's camp, strange things began to occur. One of the workers, an older Bedouin named Farid, refused to sleep near the tablet, claiming he had seen figures standing along the ridgeline above their tents. Not men, he said, but cloaked ones, with no faces and hands too long to be human. The others laughed it off, attributing it to heat stroke and wariness. But Farid disappeared before dawn, leaving behind his water flask and shoes. Dr. Myron, already uneasy, sent a telegram to his colleague, Professor Hugo Albrecht in Vienna, enclosing photographs of the tablet and asking whether any known liturgical or mystical systems could account for the symbols. The reply came 4 days later. Albrecht's response was brief and disturbing. Do not attempt to transcribe. This is the same pattern found on the Cantus Silentiae manuscripts. Destroy the tablet. Immediately. Miran, stunned, delved into research. He had heard only faint whispers of the so-called song that opens. Rumors passed in obscure esoteric circles, dismissed by most as legend. But Albrecht was not a man prone to panic. What had he seen? Ignoring the warning, Miron attempted a cautious transcription of the first few lines. He converted the symbols into tonal equivalents and had one of the graduate students hum the melody, note by trembling note. The boy's name was Ezra, a quiet, gentle youth from Thessaloniki. The next morning, Ezra was found wandering the edge of the ravine barefoot, his eyes vacant, his lips moving in silence. When approached, he began to hum the melody again, low, rhythmic, like a lullaby sung from behind a veil. He was sent back to Jerusalem under guard. In his absence, the tablet began to display signs of degradation. The etchings grew shallower, as if being worn away by invisible hands. And beneath the ground where the chamber had been uncovered, the earth began to crack, fissures forming like veins, reaching toward the camp. Then came the sound. On the fifth night, as the wind fell still, the team awoke to the unmistakable peal of a bell. Not loud, but distinct. 3 tolls, evenly spaced, though no church stood within 100 miles. The Bedouin guides fled. The horses refused to return. Dr. Miron, now gaunt and sleepless, wrote in his journal, "It follows. The melody was never meant to be found. I fear we have opened a silence not meant to be disturbed." The expedition ended abruptly. The site was sealed, and the tablet, miraculously unshattered despite its growing fragility, was boxed and placed into storage within the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. It remains there still, cataloged under restricted access, mislabeled to deter interest. But its presence was not forgotten. In 1949, a musicologist named Leila Ben Youssef requested access under the guise of comparative liturgical studies. She was granted a brief viewing. Her notes, preserved in the archives of the École Biblique, describe her shock. The markings are clearly not from this region. They resemble what I once saw in Paris, an illustration of a manuscript transcribed by Julien Favreau. The rhythm is identical. The phrase repeats in breath-like form. This is no regional hymn. It is the song. She never completed her thesis. That winter, while traveling to Marseille, she vanished aboard a steamer. Her cabin was found undisturbed, save for a page of handwritten music, weighted beneath a book. The last line had been written with shaking hand, "Adalric waits where silence is deepest." Since then, other fragments have surfaced. Scraps of melody etched into cave walls, hummed in obscure folk songs of Eastern Europe, whispered by children in dreams they do not remember. Always the same contour, always the same uncanny harmony. The desert kept its silence. The ravine was never excavated again. But the stone tablet still breathes, according to those few who have dared to be near it. The air grows still, the light bends, and the sound of a single bell can sometimes be felt, not heard but felt, beneath the skin. In our next chapter, we shall return to Europe, to the icy woods of Bohemia, where a convent stood for over 400 years, and where, in 1732, the entire order vanished overnight, leaving behind only a music box that played a tune no one could silence. For now, close your eyes and do not hum. Let the desert winds cover the song once more. Let the silence hold. Let the bells sleep. In the winter of 1732, deep in the snow-shrouded forests of Bohemia, nestled among frost-bitten birches and the skeletal remnants of ash trees, stood the convent of St. Agnes of the Vale. The convent was old, far older than records admitted, and its stones bore the pockmarks of time like ancient scars. It lay some 50 kilometers north of Prague, hidden by design, its exact location known only to a handful of cartographers and the occasional shepherd whose flocks strayed too far in search of winter grass. The Sisters of St. Agnes lived in strict enclosure, devout in their silence and in the rituals of an order long unrecognized by the Vatican. They called themselves the Daughters of the Bell, though no bell had hung in the convent tower for over 2 centuries. It had been removed, so the story went. After it rang of its own accord on a night when the moon turned red and the stream that ran past the convent turned bitter and black. The Mother Superior at the time had declared that the bell would be buried, and it was, deep beneath the chapel's floor, in a chamber sealed with salt and wax and 100 whispered prayers. In its place remained a peculiar custom. Each sister wore a thin cord of woven hair around her wrist, from which hung a tiny silver charm in the shape of a bell. These were never to ring. Not in movement, not in dream. For if even one should sound, the silence would be broken, and the threshold would begin to open once again. It was said that no one entered the convent save the occasional bishop's emissary, and none who entered ever lingered. Yet, once each decade, the sisters sent out a sealed chest to the diocese in Prague. Inside, a copy of their liturgical calendar, several hand-bound prayer books, and a music box. The music box was always the same, carved from blackened cherry wood, its surface engraved with symbols that neither the clergy nor scholars could decipher. When wound, it played a haunting, spiraling tune, soft, almost hesitant. It never repeated exactly the same melody, and though it contained no cylinder of notes as common boxes did, it always rang true. Most who heard it described it as sad, yet strangely familiar, like a lullaby half remembered from infancy. Others claimed it disturbed them deeply, evoking visions they could not explain, of cloisters drenched in shadow, of voices praying behind locked doors, of a cold so deep it rang like glass. A few priests reported hearing a bell within the tune, faint and far away, though no bell mechanism existed within the box. Then, in late February of that year, the convent fell silent. It began with a missed delivery. The chest, due on Candlemas, never arrived. The diocese, though puzzled, allowed a few weeks' delay, blaming snow and impassable roads. But by mid-March, concern grew. A party was dispatched, 2 clerks, a scribe, and a guard. They followed the narrow paths northward, snow crunching under hooves, crows silent in the trees. When they arrived at St. Agnes, the gates were closed. The outer bells rusted motionless. The air smelled of iron and candle smoke. No one came to greet them. No voices answered their call. They found the convent empty. Every door was unbarred, every cell undisturbed. Meals had been set and left uneaten. Candles burned themselves to pools of wax. Books lay open on desks, yet there were no bodies, no blood, no signs of departure or struggle. 32 nuns gone without trace. Only their woven hair cords remained, laid gently upon their beds, the silver bells silent. But it was in the chapel that the true mystery lay. The floor had cracked open, not from force, but as though split by some silent tremor. Beneath the altar, where once the ancient bell had been buried, there was now a shaft, a narrow passage descending into the earth, lined with crumbling stone and marks that glowed faintly when touched. At the edge of the opening stood the music box. It was still playing. The melody rose and fell with inhuman steadiness, never slowing, never ceasing. When touched, it stopped instantly. When left alone, it resumed. The scribes recorded the tune by ear, but found that the notation made no sense. Intervals impossible, harmonics layered beyond natural hearing. They brought the box back to Prague. It played for 3 days more and then fell silent. No amount of winding could restart it. The music was gone. The archbishop ordered the convent sealed. The shaft was covered with stone and the chapel bricked over. All records of the Daughters of the Bell were to be archived under ecclesiastical secrecy. But rumors slipped through. In 1835, a Jesuit scholar named Petr Kovář reported that he had found a psalter containing a musical refrain identical to the melody from the music box. The psalter had been discovered in a farmhouse attic near Chebon. When he played the refrain on a pipe organ, the room shook slightly, and one of the pipes cracked from base to crown. He wrote in his diary, "It is the same tune, the same silence after. Something lives in the intervals." No trace of the Daughters of the Bell has ever been found, yet travelers who pass near the old woods sometimes hear a faint chime among the birches, delicate, crystalline like silver tapping glass. Dogs refuse to walk the northern paths. Children sometimes dream of a tower with no bell and voices that say, "Don't let it ring." Next, we will travel to a castle on the Scottish coast, where in the year of the Great Comet, a noblewoman chronicled nightly visitations that began with music heard beneath her floor and ended in the complete erasure of her family line. But tonight, let your breath slow. Let no bell ring. Let the melody fade into snow and stone. In the year of the Great Comet, 1680, when the heavens themselves burned with a long white tail that drew the gaze of all Europe, a wind-battered castle stood watch upon the cliffs of Caithness in the far northern reaches of Scotland. Its name was Knocknacross, the Hill of the Cross, though few remembered why it bore that name. It had stood for over 500 years, its towers hunched like old men against the salt spray of the North Sea, its windows narrow slits where only the seabirds dared linger. Within its walls, the Lady Morven MacRae kept a detailed journal, an ornate volume bound in leather and etched with brass corners, written in a hand both precise and poetic. She was the last of her name, the final keeper of a lineage said to descend from ancient Pictish kings. The castle was quiet in her day, for her husband had passed of fever the year before, and her only son had drowned in the castle well under strange and silent circumstances. Now she lived with a few remaining servants, old and loyal, who kept the hearths lit and the hallways from crumbling. It was in November of that year, as the comet grew brighter in the sky, that Lady Morven first heard the sound. She described it thus in her journal. "It is as if someone plays a lute beneath the stone, soft and mournful, plucking not strings but wires of light. The sound begins at midnight. It echoes in the bones." At first, she thought it a trick of wind through the foundation, or the scurry of stoats between walls. But each night, the music returned, delicate, disjointed, like a tune remembered incorrectly. Then, one evening, she followed the sound down through the great hall, into the old chapel beneath the keep. There, in the chill air, scented with damp and candle wax, she stood above the crypt of her forebears and felt the vibration beneath her feet. The music was coming from below. She ordered the stone lifted. The task took 3 days. The slab was ancient, unmarked, sealed not with mortar, but something like wax and crushed bone. When it was finally removed, they found no coffin. Instead, a staircase, spiraling down into darkness untouched by air for centuries. Only she dared descend. The journal entries become more erratic from this point, the pen strokes jagged and hurried. I walked into silence, but the silence breathed. It pulsed with something not alive, yet not dead. I found a chamber carved of black stone, smooth as oil, round like a bell's inner curve. At the center, a dais. Upon it, a book. And beside the book, a bell without a clapper. She did not ring it, but she touched it, and the music stopped. When she returned to the surface, the castle had changed. The servants did not recognize her. They had aged. Their hair was white, their eyes fearful. They said she had been gone 3 weeks, not 3 hours. The comet was no longer overhead. Worse still, her name had vanished from the family register. In the castle chapel, where once the stained glass bore her image alongside her husband and son, her likeness had been replaced. The window now showed a woman cloaked in gray, faceless, holding a broken bell. And then the visitations began. At first, she heard footsteps pacing above her bedchamber, slow, even, though no one was there. Then, doors opening in the night, the smell of burning vellum in the corridors, whispers in Gaelic too old for her to understand. Her journal's tone shifted from curiosity to dread. They are here. They do not speak in words. They hum. They are waiting for something, for me, perhaps for the bell to ring once more. One by one, the remaining servants disappeared. Their beds left neat, boots aligned by the hearth, plates half cleared at the table. Only the sound remained, growing louder each night. On the final page of the journal, written in ink so dark it shines like oil, are her last words. I understand now. It is not music. It is memory. And it is not mine. The bell remembers. The bell mourns. I will join them. When a group of parishmen from Thurso came to visit the castle that spring, they found it abandoned. Fires had long gone cold, the gate ajar. No trace of Lady Morven. Only the journal, placed neatly on the chapel altar, and beneath it, a small silver bell, its clapper still missing. Local legend claims that during storms, the castle walls sing, a sound not of wind, but of melody, drawn out and sorrowful, echoing across the moors. They say it is Lady Morven's lullaby, played beneath the stone by hands unseen. Others say it is the bell, still waiting. In 1910, a team of historians from Edinburgh attempted to locate the crypt described in the journal. The chapel floor bore no seams. The staircase was gone. But one of the team, a young woman named Isabel Kerr, claimed she felt warmth when she stood on the center flagstone. She returned alone the next day. She was never seen again. In the next part of our tale, we turn to an obscure printing house in 15th century Florence, where a single book was published, then immediately banned by the church, said to contain a score that, when read aloud, drove the scribe mad. Only one copy remains, hidden in the archives of a forbidden library. But for tonight, hush your thoughts. Let the music fade. Let the stone chapel vanish into sleep, and may no bell stir in your dreams. In the waning light of the year 1487, when Florence was alive with the golden fever of Renaissance brilliance, A modest printing house near the Basilica di Santo Spirito operated quietly beneath the fragrance of ink and olive oil. It was owned by one Matteo Belladonna, a man of modest origin but exceptional craftsmanship, whose hands had pressed pages for many of the city's most curious and esoteric minds. His workshop, known simply as Sottovento, Under the Wind, produced limited runs of manuscripts that straddled the line between devotion and heresy. Belladonna was known not only for the elegance of his typeface and the fineness of his vellum, but also for his willingness to print texts others refused. He had once reproduced a fragment of Apollonius, and another time a banned treatise on angelology attributed to a monk whose name had been scratched from every known register. Yet even Belladonna approached his final commission with unease. The commission arrived by hand, a stranger cloaked in gray, face hidden, bearing no seal nor signature. He offered gold in a pouch heavy with ducats and a bundle of parchment wrapped in red silk. The manuscript bore no title on its cover, only a sigil pressed into the leather, a bell open at the bottom from which a single drop of ink appeared to fall. The first page read only, "The Voice Between the Bells." The script within was not Latin, but a strange, curling tongue reminiscent of Greek, though with characters unknown to any scholar Belladonna had ever met. Alongside each page of text was a line of music, notations that did not align with any known modal scale, printed with such precision that Belladonna, despite his skill, could not replicate them manually. He assumed it must be coded, a cipher, a secret tongue disguised in ritual language. Still, he began to print. He made only 12 copies, as instructed. The pages were to be bound in waxed ashwood, sealed with a crimson thread, and shipped not to the public, but to monasteries and private archives across the Italian peninsula. It was during the printing of the 9th copy that things began to unravel. His apprentice, Luca, a bright boy of 17, began to experience seizures. Visions, he claimed, of cloisters underwater, of figures kneeling not in prayer but in mourning. He awoke each time to the sound of bells, though none rang in the city that winter. Belladonna dismissed it as illness, but then the ink changed. Though he used the same mixture, oak gall, soot, and iron salts, the lines on the 10th copy began to bleed. The characters grew darker, almost reflective, as though absorbing light. And then came the voice. One night, alone in his shop, Belladonna heard it. A single, breathy tone, almost human, but not. It came from the press itself. He followed the sound to the last page of the manuscript he had just bound. It trembled in the lamplight. The musical staff beneath the final passage seemed to move, undulating like the shimmer of heat above coals. The next morning, he burned that copy in the hearth, but it did not burn easily. The pages blackened, but did not curl. The ink hissed as if wet. The flame dimmed around it as though it drew breath from fire itself. Belladonna, terrified, sought counsel with the Dominican monks at San Marco. They refused to touch the book but recorded his testimony. That account remains in their archive, locked and rarely shown. It ends with the following phrase: "The melody is not for ears. It is for what listens beyond hearing." A week later, Matteo Belladonna vanished from his workshop. No sign of struggle, no final letter. His press was left mid-cycle, the 12th and final copy half-bound. The apprentice, Luca, fled Florence that same night, leaving behind only a scrawled note. The bells sang, and I knew my name was not mine. Of the 12 copies, only 5 were ever confirmed. 3 were destroyed, one in a fire at a monastery in Naples, another during the sack of Rome, and the third dissolved by acid in the hands of a Venetian scholar who claimed it hummed when touched. A 4th copy is rumored to rest in the Vatican's Archivum Secretum. The 5th, perhaps the only known intact, was uncovered in 1994 by a German librarian cataloging a private collection in Munich. She opened the cover. She read the first line. She wept without knowing why. That night, she placed the book on her nightstand face down and tried to sleep. But a sound began in her dreams, like voices singing backwards, as though through water. She woke to find the room filled with frost, her breath visible. The book opened to a page she had not reached. On it, a musical line had been written by hand, in modern ink. Her name was at the top. The book vanished days later, taken by officials who offered no names. The room in which it had been stored was found coated in a thin layer of soot, though no fire had been present. To this day, no scholar can fully decipher the voice between the bells. Its language defies phonetics. Its music, when played, has been reported to cause hallucinations, memory loss, or in rare cases, complete cessation of the heartbeat during sleep. And always, just before the final page, the same line appears. The bells rang, though no one pulled the rope. In our next chapter, we journey to a remote alpine village in Switzerland, where every 7th winter, the inhabitants perform a ritual song of unknown origin, claiming it is the only thing that keeps the hollow walkers from emerging from the cliffs. But for now, let the ink dry, let the press fall silent, and may no voice call your name from between the bells. High in the shadowed folds of the Swiss Alps, where the snow lies deep even in spring and the wind speaks with an ancient tongue, there lies a village that does not appear on most maps. Its name is Schattendorf, and it sits cradled between sheer cliffs and pine-choked slopes, where no road dares descend and no rail ever reached. Only a single path, twisting, narrow, often lost to the snow, connects it to the world below. The villagers speak a dialect older than any recorded in the region. A blend of High Alemannic, Old Romansh, and something else, something no linguist has ever fully cataloged. They live simply, as they have for generations, raising goats, tending barley, and keeping to old customs without question. But it is their ritual, the singing of the depth, that has drawn rare visitors over the centuries, often scholars, monks, or the odd occultist who heard whispers of the event in dusty libraries or overheard the name Schattendorf spoken in passing by a dying traveler. The ritual is performed once every 7 winters, on the night of the final full moon before the vernal equinox. The villagers call it Die Singnacht, the night of singing. It begins at dusk and ends just before dawn. During this time, no outsider is permitted to speak, to write, or to record. Those who have defied this rule have vanished, or worse, returned with their minds cracked open like thawed ice. The villagers gather in the small stone chapel at the heart of the village. There is no priest, no sermon, only the song. It is led by the eldest woman of the village, always a woman, always the eldest, who begins with a single note. A tone long and trembling, held until the others join in. No instruments are used, no pitch pipes, no reference. Yet the harmony is impossibly perfect, evolving in strange intervals that seem to build not toward crescendo, but inward, spiraling tighter and tighter, like a staircase descending into the earth. In 1889, a folklorist Johann Baumgartner visited Schattendorf under the pretense of documenting alpine burial rites. He earned the villagers' trust over months of hard work and humility, slowly learning fragments of their tongue. When the Singnacht approached, he was allowed to observe, but only under the strict condition of silence and presence. He kept a journal by lamplight that night, scribbling in the dim corners of his room above the inn. His entries became more disjointed as the night went on. They sing with eyes closed. The children, too, even the animals are still. It's not a melody, it's a shape. The sound turns like a key. At midnight, the ground trembled. No one flinched. The cliffs echoed back something that didn't originate here. His final entry was written at dawn. I heard my name in the echo. Baumgartner left the village the next day. He never spoke of what he heard. His journal was discovered years later in a monastery archive near Luzerne. Accompanying the journal was a scrap of parchment he had taken from the chapel wall, believing it to be part of an old hymn. It bore no Latin. Only 3 words in ink so faded it shimmered, clinked onisile. Rings without rope. In 1921, an ethnomusicologist named Sophia Heller arrived in the village under careful pretense. She had discovered references to Schattendorf in the banned letters of a Carthusian monk who claimed the villagers sang back to what slept in the mountain. She was denied entry to the chapel, but stood outside in the dark, bundled against the cold, her ears pressed to the ancient stone. What she heard defied transcription. She later described it as a harmony that felt like a memory, but not mine, a sadness too vast to be human. She claimed the mountain itself hummed in reply, and for days after she could not hear bird song or the voices of other people, only the echo of that song. She returned to Vienna and composed a piece titled Echoes Beneath Schattendorf, but refused to allow it to be performed. In her notes she wrote, "It is not a song to be shared. It is a ward. If sung in the wrong place, it may attract what it was meant to keep away." To this day, Schattendorf holds its ritual without fail. Outsiders are no longer permitted. The path to the village becomes impassable, and any who attempt to climb it in the week before Singnacht are turned away by storms that roll in without warning. Some say the villagers no longer even age, that the same faces remain, generation after generation. A hiker once claimed to have stumbled upon the village during the rite. He said he heard the song before he saw the lights, voices echoing through pine and snow like foghorns beneath the mountain. He turned back before he reached the chapel. But in the years following, he was haunted by a sound that returned in his sleep, the toll of a bell he never saw, sounding from somewhere impossibly far and impossibly close. When he died, at the age of 64, his final words were, "They are still singing, and now I remember the tune." In the next chapter, we will descend into the catacombs beneath a forgotten cathedral in northern Spain, where in 1602, a group of pilgrims discovered a sealed door carved with symbols that matched those found in the scrolls of Saint Yvel. What they found behind it was not bones, but breath. But tonight, may no echoes rise. May your sleep be deep and dreamless. And if you hear singing in the mountains, turn away. Let the cliffs keep their silence. In the ancient province of León, where the winds run dry across the hills and stone paths wind toward forgotten shrines, there once stood a cathedral known only to the devout as Santa Penumbra, Saint of the Shadows. It was never listed among the grand cathedrals of Spain, never praised for its architecture or its relics. Instead, it was a place of pilgrimage for those drawn not by miracles, but by the absence of them. A place whispered about in monasteries, rarely written of, and even more rarely entered. It was said the cathedral had no choir, that no mass was ever sung, and that the only sound permitted within its nave was that of footsteps upon ancient flagstone, deliberate, hesitant, as though not to wake something sleeping below. In the year 1602, a small group of pilgrims made their way to Santa Penumbra. They came not from wealth or rank, but from a ruined priory near Zaragoza, following dreams shared by each of them. Dreams of bells tolling beneath the ground, of song with no source, and of a phrase that none had ever learned but all could repeat: to breathe where silence breathes. The cathedral stood at the edge of a withered wood, its spire broken, its windows soot-stained. The great doors opened without resistance, though the dust upon their hinges suggested centuries of stillness. Inside, the nave was bare, no pews, no altar, only long shadows and the faint scent of wax and ash. The pilgrims prayed, knelt, waited. At dusk, one of them, a young novice named Clara, noticed a draft, a whisper of cooler air rising from beneath the central transept. Upon closer inspection, she discovered a seam in the stone, a square outline where the tiles differed slightly in tone. With effort, they pried it open. Beneath was a staircase of damp stone, spiraling downward into utter black. They descended. What they found beneath was not a crypt. It was a corridor, long, narrow, curving in a way that defied architecture. The walls were smooth and pulsed faintly with warmth. The air grew thinner, not in a way that choked, but in a way that made them whisper instinctively. At the end of the corridor, they found the door. It was of no wood or metal, they knew, black, veined like marble, yet humming softly when touched. Upon its surface were symbols, curved, complex, almost floral. Among them one stood out, a bell, open at the base, but inverted, pointing downward as though buried. Beneath it, 3 lines of script. The first in Latin, respira ubi tacibitur, breathe where it shall fall silent. The second in Greek, anaklisis meso cop, the opening amid silence. The third in no known language, merely a series of repeating sigils, recognizable only to those who had seen the scrolls of Saint Yvel. They opened the door. It did not creak or resist. It simply yielded, as if exhaling. Beyond lay a chamber unlike any in Europe. Oval, womb-like, its walls were embedded with what appeared to be veins of crystal, faintly glowing with internal light. At its center was a dais upon which rested no reliquary or coffin, but a mouth. Not of stone or metal, not sculpted, but living, round and moist and breathing, slowly as if asleep. The pilgrims fell to their knees, not in reverence, in instinct. The sound that emanated from the mouth was not song, but tone, steady, resonant, like the deepest note of a bell held forever just before release. Clara approached. Her hands shook. She extended her fingers toward the mouth, and when she touched it, it sighed. and the tone changed. It became a melody, not sung, not played, simply heard in the body and the mind all at once. The pilgrims wept, screamed, fell into convulsions, their minds filled with faces they had never known, places they had never seen, sorrow and joy not their own. And through it all, the bell tone kept its rhythm, binding the memory together like a spine. Only Clara remained standing. When she emerged, alone from beneath the cathedral 3 days later, her hair had turned white. Her eyes no longer blinked. She spoke a phrase that the friars of Santa Maria la Real later recorded in trembling script. The song is not for ears. It is for what listens beneath us. The cathedral was sealed, walled with brick, and cursed in Latin rites long forgotten. Clara was taken to a convent in Burgos, where she remained mute for years, until one night, during a storm, she sang. No one recognized the tune. All the nuns who heard it died in their sleep. The convent was abandoned. In 1981, the ruins of Santa Penumbra were briefly examined by an academic from Salamanca named Joaquin Villar. He documented the strange curvature of its substructure and noted magnetic interference in the chapel floor. But when he attempted to locate the door beneath the transept, he found only stone. The seam was gone. The corridor vanished. But his recordings, kept on magnetic reel, captured something. At precisely 3:12 a.m. on the second night, the tape picked up a low tone, followed by 5 distinct tolls of a bell. No bell stood within 10 miles of the site. The cathedral, it seemed, remembered. Next, we will travel to the foggy lowlands of East Anglia, where in the 14th century, an entire village vanished overnight, leaving behind only a church organ still playing a tune no one could name, and a journal written in a hand that no one ever claimed. But now, let your breath match the silence. Let the sound retreat to where it sleeps. May your dreams be doorless. May the bell not call your name. Part 11. The morning sun rose pale and hesitant over the village of Sealbrook, filtered through a veil of thin mist that refused to lift. It lent a silver-blue hue to the stone cottages and hung low in the air like a breath held too long. The world seemed to move slower that day, as if even time dared not disturb the uneasy stillness that had settled over the land. The fields were quiet. The birds, usually jubilant in their songs, offered only faint chirrups, as if mourning some unseen sorrow. At the edge of the hamlet, where the trees of Greyleaf Hollow stretched their gnarled fingers skyward, stood the ancient well of St. Meriden. Few approached it willingly now, though its stone rim bore the marks of centuries of use. The villagers once believed the well to be blessed, its waters said to hold healing powers granted by a long-forgotten saint. But no one drank from it anymore. Not since the girl vanished. Elira, the baker's youngest daughter, had been no older than 10. A child with hair the color of ripened wheat and a voice that often carried sweet songs into the morning air as she fetched water for her family. One dawn, she had gone out as usual, singing a lullaby older than the village itself, bucket swinging on her small arm. But she never returned. The bucket was found, toppled on the mossy stones, its rope frayed in a manner that none could explain. The well's water had turned cloudy for 3 days after. The villagers whispered of an old curse. Some claimed to have heard soft humming from the hollow at night, matching the tune Elira often sang. Others said the trees had grown closer to the well, inching forward imperceptibly, as if shielding a secret. The truth was harder to grasp, like smoke slipping through clenched fingers. In the weeks that followed, other strange occurrences surfaced. Cattle were found dead, their eyes open in terror, with no sign of wound or illness. Livestock refused to graze near the western hedgerow. Lanterns flickered at dusk, even without a breeze. And worst of all, children began to dream of Elira. They spoke in their sleep, reciting fragments of her lullaby in a language none could name, their eyes moving wildly beneath closed lids. An elder named Wulrich took it upon himself to investigate. He had been a monk once, a keeper of arcane texts and ancient knowledge. His fingers trembled with age, but his mind remained sharp, harboring memories of forgotten lore. He began spending his nights beneath the stars near the well, listening, watching. And on one such night, he claimed to have seen her. He described a figure, small, barefoot, draped in a white nightdress hovering just above the stones. Her hair, tangled and wild, shimmered silver in the moonlight. Her eyes, however, were the color of ink, deep and endless, and they did not blink. She did not speak, but moved her lips in silent rhythm, mimicking the lullaby that now haunted every child's dream. Woolrich was not a man prone to fear, yet his voice quavered as he recounted what he saw. He insisted she was not alone. Shadows circled behind her, shapes too large and swift to be human. The village priest, Father Emmerich, refused to believe such tales. He urged calm, preaching that grief could twist the mind and give shape to unfounded fears. But even he avoided the well when night fell. He never said so aloud, but his prayers grew longer and more desperate. Woolrich, desperate for answers, ventured into the hollow during daylight, seeking the source of the disturbance. He found a clearing, unnaturally symmetrical, with a circle of mushrooms so pale they seemed to glow. In its center lay a doll, Alira's, unmistakably hers, its cloth stained with something dark and sticky. As he reached down to retrieve it, a sudden wind whipped through the trees, though the leaves did not rustle. The doll crumbled to dust in his hands. Returning to Salebrook, Woolrich grew quiet. He spent his days in the chapel, poring over an ancient tome he had once rescued from the monastery ruins after the Great Fire. The book bore no title, only a symbol etched into the leather, an eye within a spiral. Its pages were filled with diagrams of wells, circles, and runes. One passage, scrawled in a hand unlike the rest, told of the mouth beneath the world, a void said to hunger for innocence and echo with the voices of those it consumed. It spoke of thin places, where the veil between this world and the next wore dangerously thin. Wells, it said, were often such places, dug deep enough to scratch the hidden layers of reality, and if the earth remembered blood spilled near its mouth, it might never sleep again. Woolrich feared that Alira had not simply vanished. She had been taken, swallowed by something older than the village, older than the stones themselves. That winter, the villagers awoke to find frost patterns in the shape of spirals on every window. The snow that fell upon the well never melted, and children began speaking in their sleep again, this time with tears on their cheeks. Woolrich knew then that the well was no longer dormant. It had tasted sorrow and now thirsted for more. He gathered a group of trusted villagers, those who still remembered the old ways, the rituals from before the church bells had first rung in Salebrook. They carried salt, ash, iron nails, and a chalice of holy water. Under the moon's watch, they sealed the well with stone, carving protective runes into its rim and binding them with a whispered chant from the old tongue. For a time, the village grew calm again. The dreams ceased, and the birds returned to their morning songs. But even now, decades later, mothers tell their children never to sing near still water. The stone lid of the well remains cold, even in midsummer, and moss refuses to grow on its surface. And some nights, when the moon is full and high, a faint humming may yet be heard, soft as a breath, drifting from beneath the earth. Part 12. The snow had long since melted, and the springtime fields around Salebrook blossomed with the blush of fresh life. Yet beneath the blooming hedgerows and fragrant apple blossoms, an unspoken dread clung to the soil like a buried ember, refusing to die. The well of St. Meridan lay sealed, its stones cold as death, and though the village pressed forward with the rhythm of planting and prayer, none dared tread too close to it. Years passed. Children grew into adulthood, and those who remembered Alira spoke of her name only in hushed tones, as if uttering it too clearly might rouse something listening below. Father Emmerich, whose hair had turned silver with age, continued to tend the chapel. His sermons became softer, more contemplative. He no longer dismissed the old tales. In fact, he had begun to study them. It was during one of these studies, beneath the candlelight of a spring evening, that he uncovered an entry in a centuries-old parish registry, a record of a previous disappearance at the same well, nearly 100 years before Alira, a boy, nameless, listed only as orphan, found at doorstep, missing, presumed drowned. His body was never recovered. The note was accompanied by a sketch of a sigil, an eye within a spiral, the same symbol Woolrich had once seen. The priest's hand trembled. He traced the ink with his finger, feeling an ancient resonance stir in the room. What unnerved him most was not the symbol itself, but what lay beneath the entry, a marginal scribble in faded ink, barely legible. The well takes what it remembers. The spiral turns again. Father Emmerich began to ask questions quietly. He spoke to the elderly, those whose parents had spoken of strange dreams or signs in the woods. One widow, Megran, remembered her mother's tales of whispering winds and water that sang at midnight. She spoke of an older name for the well, lost to time, the Hollow Mouth. It was said to have once been a gathering place for rituals long before the village chapel was built. Unwilling to stir fear, the priest did not speak of his findings in sermons, but he did begin placing blessed iron nails at the chapel threshold and tucked small satchels of rosemary and rowan leaves beneath the pews. He walked the perimeter of the well at dawn, reciting old prayers in Latin, though he knew not what good it might do. That summer, something changed. It began with the animals. Again, not death this time, but absence. Chickens vanished in the night without a trace. Sheep were found huddled at the far edge of their pastures, eyes wide with silent terror, refusing to go near their usual grazing spots. And then came the dreams. At first, it was only one boy, Thomas, the blacksmith's son. He began to wake with blood on his fingertips, not his own, but thin scratches etched into the wood of his bed frame, always in a spiral. He claimed he heard singing, a Lyra's lullaby, only now slowed, distorted, like it was being sung underwater. Then other children began to murmur in their sleep, murmurs that grew into full verses. None of them remembered it come morning. The village faced a decision: pretend as before that nothing was wrong, or face what they had long buried. Father Emeric, with all the weight of his age and station, called for a council, not of the faithful, but of the keepers. These were the descendants of the old families, Wulrich's bloodline, the midwives who still whispered to herbs, the storytellers who kept the old names alive. They met under the great elm behind the chapel, where the stone circle from pagan days had been dismantled but never fully forgotten. There, they shared stories never spoken aloud, and it was agreed something had been disturbed, something that the sealing of the well had only suppressed, not ended. The spiral they feared was turning again. An old midwife named Anwin stepped forward with a tale of her own. She had once traveled beyond Keelbrook to a village called Hartley, where a similar well had been unearthed during a storm. Within days, birds fell from the sky and the townsfolk fled. That well bore the same sigil. Hartley was gone now, abandoned and left to the ivy. She brought with her a worn page from an older book than any in the chapel, speaking of the wells of listening earth, said to be entrances to a realm beneath the skin of the world, where memory lived, hungered, and echoed. The decision was made. They would not unseal the well. To disturb it again might be to awaken it fully. Instead, they would ward it, strengthen the bindings, and perhaps, in doing so, lull it back to sleep. But this time they would not rely on scripture alone. They called upon every forgotten charm, every whispered protection, every grain of salt and scrap of iron. They sang the lullaby backwards, pouring honey and milk into the earth in a peace offering. They circled the well under moonlight, never touching the stone, reciting the names of every child lost to it. And for a time, the quiet returned, a tentative peace, fragile as frost upon grass. The children ceased their murmurings, the animals returned to calm. Even the air seemed to breathe easier. Yet one thing could not be undone. The spiral had turned, however briefly, and the well remembered. For deep below, where water licked the stone and roots reached like blind fingers into dark soil, something stirred. It did not speak. It did not move. But it waited. And in the dreams of one young girl, barely old enough to form full words, a voice not her own began to whisper. Not in song this time, but in question. "Do you remember me?" it asked. The girl in her sleep smiled. "Yes," she whispered back. "You're the one beneath." Part 13. Autumn came quietly to Sealbrook, ushered in by winds that stirred the golden leaves into gentle dances along the cobbled paths. The air turned crisper with each passing day, the scent of wood smoke curling through the chimneys and lacing the village with the comfort of hearths and stew pots. Yet beneath the warmth of harvest, an unease simmered, unspoken yet palpably felt. Little Marin, daughter of the weaver, had begun speaking of her dreams. She was not prone to chatter, nor given to wild fancies. A solemn child with storm-gray eyes and a voice scarcely louder than a whisper, she was often found sitting beside the brook behind her family's cottage, plaiting grass into quiet shapes. Her mother thought little of it. Children dream, after all, and they often carry the echoes of old tales told in candlelight. But Marin's dreams were different. She spoke of a place made of roots and dripping stone, where the air was thick and still, and a soft humming came from above. She said she stood in a circle of lights, small, flickering flames that hovered without wick or wind. In the center always was a well, but not as it stood in Sealbrook. This one was made of bone-white stone, its rim etched with spirals that pulsed like heartbeats. And someone waited there, a girl with long hair the color of drowned straw and a dress soaked to the hem. She never moved, never blinked. She only watched. "She tells me things," Marin said one morning while helping her mother wind wool. "Things no one else knows." Her mother froze, the yarn slipping from her hands. "What kind of things, love?" "She says there's another door. Not just the well, one made of song." Marin looked up, eyes distant, and she says if I follow the right tune, I'll find her. That night, Father Emmerich visited the weaver's home. Marin sat on the floor, humming a tune he recognized at once, Elira's lullaby, note for note, though no one had sung it aloud in many years. The girl smiled at him, serene. "She says she remembers your voice," she said, and then returned to her humming. The priest felt something old twist in his stomach. He knew then that the presence had not returned by chance. It had been biding time, waiting for another thread in the tapestry to tug loose. Wulrich's granddaughter, Anselma, now keeper of his old texts, was summoned. She brought with her the Book of Spirals, the same that had guided her grandfather. Together, she and Emmerich combed its brittle pages for meaning. One passage caught their breath. When the dream of the well repeats, and a child speaks its name without teaching, the seal begins to unravel. The song is the key, and innocence the vessel. They realized too late that sealing the stone had not silenced the well's hunger. It had only shifted its reach. Where it once took bodies, it now took dreams. And dreams, Emmerich understood with growing dread, were doors. Word spread slowly, cautiously. Most villagers chose not to believe. The world was dangerous enough without admitting the existence of old hungers beneath the soil. But those who remembered, those who had witnessed the strange silences and frost spirals, watched Marin closely. Her dreams continued. She began speaking in her sleep, her words fluid and strange. Anselma recorded them by candlelight, comparing them to the fragmented Latin and the older tongues in Wulrich's book. There were phrases she could not translate, but the pattern was clear. She was being taught. Not overtly, not with knowledge, but with rhythm, with memory. One night, the humming stopped. Marin awoke, eyes wide and wet, and cried out not in fear but in loss. "She's gone," she whispered. She went deeper. She told me I had to follow soon. The Council of Keepers convened again. Anselma, Emmerich, Magrin, and others who remembered Hearthly, the hollow mouth, and the frozen spirals. They debated what could be done. But the truth was stark. There was no undoing what had begun. The seal might have blocked the well's physical hunger, but its voice remained, and through Marin it had begun to sing again. So they chose a different path. Not resistance, but redirection. They sought to lull the presence back into dormancy, not with stone, but with remembrance. They began a rite of song, old and somber, meant to soothe rather than banish. And Selma led it, her voice steady and mournful, accompanied by bells of iron and bowls of blessed water. The lullaby was not Elira's, but one older still, pulled from the crumbling pages of forgotten texts. They sang beneath the harvest moon, circled around the sealed well, each holding a small token, an heirloom, a letter, a child's toy. Marin stood at the edge, silent, eyes fixed on the cold stone. As the last note faded into the night, she spoke. She says, "It's not just the well. There are more. One beneath the northern forest, one under the sea cliffs, another inside the mountain. They remember too." The villagers stared at her, the hush deeper than any they had known. A wind stirred the trees, though no storm approached. The sky remained clear, the stars fixed and bright. And yet something shifted. The earth seemed to breathe. Father Emmerich, in his quiet wisdom, realized they were not facing a singular evil, but a network of memories, places where sorrow had pooled and grown sentient, and they had touched one of many. He returned to his chapel and wrote into the margin of the same book where the old note had once read, "The spiral turns again." He added, "It never ceased. It only waited." And somewhere, far from Selbrook, in a forgotten glen beyond the northern pines, another well opened its eyes. Part 14. Beyond the northern ridge of Sealbrook, Where the land folds into forested silence and paths fade into memory, there lies a place few remember and fewer still dare to speak of. It is known in fragments, whispered in the old tongue as Thornholt, though the name no longer appears on maps nor on the lips of common folk. Time itself seems to avoid it, and those who wander near speak of strange winds and the feeling of being watched. Once, long ago, Thornholt had been a settlement, small, proud, and devout in its reverence of the earth. Its people had tilled the soil, sung to the stars, and honored the hidden things that dwelled in shadow. They built no church, but gathered instead around a stone circle deep within the woods, where water bubbled from a spring that never froze, even in the hardest winters. But that spring, like all things beneath the surface, held more than it revealed. Legends tell that Thornholt's last elder, a woman named Iredell, had visions, dreams of a sunless land below, where voices echoed not through air, but through memory itself. She spoke of roots that twined like fingers, of flickering shapes in the water, and of a song carried by windless breath. She warned her kin not to drink too deeply from the spring. But by then, it was too late. One by one, the villagers began to change. They grew pale, restless. They wandered at night, their eyes clouded as if with silt, and their voices began to speak in tones not their own. The children sang lullabies they had never been taught. And when Iredell herself disappeared, leaving behind only a spiral etched into her floorboards, the village was abandoned. Or so it was believed. It was to this place that Anselma now traveled, guided by Marin's final dream, spoken in half-formed words and fevered whispers. She and a small group of keepers made their way through the thick woods. The trees here grew too closely together, their trunks bowed inward as if eavesdropping on every footstep. No birds called. No leaves rustled. Only the hush of anticipation, as though the forest held its breath. By dusk, they reached the clearing where Thornholt had once stood. No homes remained, only crumbled stones and mossy outlines of forgotten hearts. But the spring was still there, nestled within the roots of an ancient oak whose limbs stretched so wide they seemed to embrace the sky. And in its center, where the water once danced clear and bright, stood a well. It was not large, nor imposing. Its rim was carved of pale stone, worn smooth by time. But it bore the mark, the eye within the spiral. Faint, but unmistakable. Anselma stepped closer, her breath catching. The water within was still, black as obsidian, reflecting no light, no face, only the shape of the sky, distorted. She knelt, placing her hand near the edge, not touching, only sensing. And then came the whisper. Not in her ears, but in her mind. A brush of thought, a forgotten melody, a mother's voice calling a child in the night. It was not threatening, not yet, but it was vast, it was aware. She stood quickly, her voice steady. It dreamed still. That night, they camped at the edge of the glade. No one slept. The air was too thick, too laden with the sense of watching. Anselma, seated near the fire, opened Woolrich's book once more. Its pages now seemed more alive than ever, responding almost to her presence. One passage shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight. There are many mouths, but one hunger. Each well remembers the song. To silence it, one must offer not fear, but story. Memory binds memory. Speak the truth of the lost. Weep, and it shall listen. She realized then what they must do. At dawn, with the mist clinging low to the forest floor, Anselma stood before the well and began to speak. She told of Elira, of her songs and her laughter, of the day she vanished and the hollow that followed. She spoke of Marin, the quiet girl with dreaming eyes, who had borne the voice of the thing beneath, yet never lost her gentleness. One by one, the others joined her, telling stories not of horror, but of love, of remembrance, of lives lived and lost. Names were spoken, tears were shed, and slowly the air shifted. The water in the well quivered. A faint sound rose, not a song, but a sigh, as if the earth for the briefest moment exhaled. The spiral on the stone grew fainter. Anselma knew then it could not be sealed, not with iron or prayer alone. It could only be soothed, not silenced, but quieted with memory. These wells, these mouths beneath the world, did not feed on flesh. They fed on forgetting, on the unspoken, on the discarded grief that lingers in places no longer named. As they turned to leave, a single petal from the ancient oak drifted down and landed upon the well. It did not sink. It rested there, calm and still. And miles away in Kelbrook, Marin awoke in her bed, tears on her cheeks, smiling softly. She heard them, she whispered, and she remembers. Part 15. The road back from Thornholt was quieter than it had been on the journey out. Anselma and the others walked in near silence, not out of fear but reverence. Each step feeling like a prayer, each rustle of the underbrush a quiet hymn. They had not closed the well in Thornholt, nor did they intend to. Instead, they had offered something truer than seals and stones, remembrance. And remembrance, they were beginning to understand, was its own kind of binding. Back in Silbrook, the days passed with a gentler rhythm. The frost came early that year, crisping the edges of the last autumn leaves, but it did not bring dread as it once had. There were no spiral patterns on the windows, no sleep-muttered lullabies. Marin played in the fields again, her laughter shy but returning, as if something inside her was slowly untwisting. Still, Anselma did not rest. She spent her evenings in Woolrich's study, surrounded by the parchment scent of old pages and flickering candlelight. Each text she examined seemed to speak louder now, its meanings blooming in her mind like ink dropped in water. What once seemed like scattered legends were, she now saw, fragments of a greater truth. There were more wells. That much was certain. Not all were stone-rimmed and sunken into forest glades. Some were hidden beneath foundations of old monasteries. Some whispered from beneath dried riverbeds. Some had long been built over, forgotten by time and the living, but not by the earth. One account, from a crumbling manuscript sent decades earlier to Woolrich by a fellow scholar in the West, spoke of a monastery called Carith on Fell. Built high in the northern reaches, its monks were said to have vanished entirely one winter, leaving behind only a circle of footprints in the snow and a bell that rang for 7 nights with no hand to pull it. The monastery, it seemed, had been built atop one of the mouths, and in the margins, a single phrase was inked in small, spidery letters. They prayed not to silence the hunger, but to be remembered by it. Anselma read the line again and again. What if the danger was not merely in the wells themselves, but in being forgotten by them? She brought this theory to Father Emmerich, whose face had grown more lined in recent months, but whose mind remained sharp as any blade. Together they discussed what it might mean, that these ancient entities, these sleeping hungers beneath the world, thrived not merely on sorrow, but on erasure. What if, Emmerich mused one evening, our stories are not only our shields, but our offerings? That to name what has happened, to tell it fully and without fear, is what keeps us separate from the silence. Anselma nodded. And what if, in the telling, we become part of their memory, but not their victims? So they began to gather stories, not of horrors or vanishing children, but of lives lived around the wells. Stories passed down from elders, fragments of song, lines of prayer in forgotten tongues. They wrote them down, bound them in a growing tome they named the Archive of the Remembered Earth. Each entry was carefully scribed, not as a ward, but as a gift, a thread placed upon the tapestry of the world. They trained the children to speak their ancestors' names aloud during festivals. They lit lanterns on the old holy nights and left offerings of honey and herbs by the stone-lidded well of St. Meriden, not to pacify but to recognize, to remember. And still, deep beneath the surface, the listening continued. Marin, whose dreams had quieted since the rite at Thornholt, began to draw pictures. Simple sketches, done in charcoal and chalk, of faces she said she had seen while asleep. The figures were not frightening. They were soft-eyed and solemn, standing in circles beneath root-veiled ceilings, holding hands. These are the ones who were taken, she explained one morning, but not lost. She showed Anselma a drawing of a girl with long, damp hair and hollow eyes. She remembers us now. She said thank you. The keeper's throat tightened. She recognized the figure, not from sight, but from the echo of a name long unspoken, Alira. A new understanding began to blossom in Sealbrook. The village did not forget the terror, but it ceased to fear it. The well remained sealed, but not as a prison, rather as a reminder. Around it, they built a small garden of thyme and lavender. Children played near it again, watched carefully, yes, but not forbidden. And each midsummer, they sang songs into its silence, not to awaken, but to honor. Anselma knew this balance would not last forever. Somewhere, another well might stir. Somewhere else, forgetting might fester. But for now, they had bought time. More than that, they had begun to weave a pattern, one of remembrance, of gentle defiance. In the final days of autumn, as the first snows dusted the eaves of Kilbrook, Anselma sat alone in Woolrich's study. She penned a new passage in the archive. Let it be known that to speak the truth of sorrow is not to invite it, but to bind it with the golden thread of memory. Let no child be taken into silence. Let the earth itself recall us gently. She set down her quill, and far beneath her feet, where roots curl like ancient script and water dreams in darkness, the well remembered. Part 16. Snow fell steadily upon Kilbrook, wrapping the village in a hush deeper than silence. The rooftops wore mantles of white, and the winding lanes became pale rivers between stone and timber. Winter, always a time of stillness, had taken on a peculiar weight this year, less a season than a vigil. In the hearth-lit homes, families spoke more softly, and even the children seemed to sense the quiet reverence that now lingered in the village air. Inside the chapel, where flickering candlelight cast long shadows against ancient stone, Father Emerick lay resting in a high-backed chair, wrapped in furs and sheepskin. His hands, veined and trembling, were clasped over a worn leather journal. His breath had become shallow, and his once commanding voice now little more than a hushed murmur. Though time had bent his frame and paled his features, his mind remained untouched by frailty. He had spent his final days not in despair, but in contemplation, whispering to himself lines of old scripture and fragments from the archive Anselma had helped compile. Anselma was often by his side in those quiet days. She had come to see the priest not only as a mentor, but as a companion bound by shared burden. Their connection had deepened, drawn together by the gravity of what they had uncovered, and the understanding that the story of the wells was far from finished. She would sit for hours beside him, reading softly or simply keeping vigil, her presence calm and constant. One evening, as snow pressed gently against the stained glass and silence pooled in every crevice of the chapel, Emerick stirred. His lips moved with effort, and Anselma leaned close. "I dreamed," he whispered, his eyes half-lidded, barely focused, "of the sea cliffs. There is another well there. I could hear it." Anselma's breath caught. "What did it say?" she asked, though she already sensed the answer. He smiled faintly. "It didn't speak, but it wept." The image rooted itself in her mind, an ocean-lashed precipice, mist curling like smoke, and a well not of stone but of sorrow. She imagined the sound of the waves masking a quiet grief beneath. There was a different kind of presence there, perhaps. Not hunger, not malice, but mourning. Something lost. Emerick gripped her hand, barely. "You must find it," he said so quietly that the words seemed to settle like dust. "Remember them, even the ones who never had names." That night, the priest closed his eyes and passed gently into death. No agony marked his departure, only a stillness that deepened, as though a candle had been allowed to burn itself out. The villagers mourned not with loud wails, but with tender rituals. They wrapped his body in linen, placed a sprig of lavender and juniper in each palm, and laid him to rest beside the chapel he had served faithfully for more than half a century. Snow blanketed his grave within hours, the kind of snow that muffles even thought. Yet the chapel bell, untouched by hand, rang once during the night, clear, resonant, a single note of farewell. The following morning, Anselma prepared her journey. There was no need for discussion. She knew the way the heart knows sorrow, instinctively and without question. The cliffs of Carithmar lay 3 days' walk to the west, past frozen moors and wind-bent hills. The journey would be treacherous in winter, but time, she felt, was not something she could waste. The villagers watched her depart without fanfare, though many left small tokens, bread, dried fruit, a charm for safe passage. Marin offered her a folded drawing, a picture of the sea with a single tear falling into its waves. Anselma tucked it carefully into her satchel and set off into the pale dawn. The path grew narrower the further west she went. Forests thinned into rolling hills dusted with frost, and the sky became a low, unbroken gray. Each night, she camped beneath the sparse shelter of trees, reading from the archive by firelight. Each morning she felt the pull of the cliffs more keenly, as if something waited not to be discovered, but to be remembered. On the third evening, just as the light waned into a dusky silver, she reached the edge of the world. The cliffs rose sheer from the crashing sea, their faces jagged and dark. Mist clung to the rocks like sorrow given form. The wind here was constant, keening with a sound that blurred the line between nature and lamentation. And there, nestled in a cove hidden from sight unless one knew to seek it, she found the well. It was not like the others. There was no constructed rim, no carved sigils. It had been formed by time and tide, a hollow in the stone where salt water collected between tides. The rock around it was smooth, worn by centuries of wind and wave. Sea glass glittered among the pebbles at its edge, and strands of kelp clung like offerings. Anselma approached slowly, her boots crunching against the stones. The water within the hollow was still, too still. It did not reflect her face. It showed only the sky, deep, dark, clouded. She knelt, drawing a line of powdered rosemary, salt, and ash around the rim. This was not a warding, not a circle of fear. It was an invitation. Then she listened, and from the depths she heard it, weeping. Not loud, not angry, but persistent. The kind of sorrow that had no words left. It rose into her chest like a tide, and tears gathered in her eyes before she understood why. She opened the archive and began to read. She spoke of Father Emmerich, his youth, his steadfastness, the way he had shepherded a village through silence and fear. She told of the bell that rang for him, the snow that wrapped his grave, the memory he had left like a candle still flickering. She spoke of names lost to time, of children vanished, of lullabies that held the shape of grief. Her voice trembled but did not falter, and the wind stilled. The waves hushed for a heartbeat. The air grew warmer, strangely, and a light stirred beneath the water, a faint blue glow, like a soul rising. It hovered just beneath the surface, pulsing slowly in rhythm with the breath of the sea. Anselma whispered, "We remember." The light faded gently, as if exhaling. She sat by the well through the night, writing by lantern light, keeping watch. In the morning, she left a page torn from the archive, Emmerich's name written in her careful script, anchored beneath a smooth stone. Then she turned homeward. Sealbrook welcomed her with quiet warmth. Snow had thickened on the rooftops, but the hearths burned bright. Marin met her by the chapel steps, holding a new drawing, this time of a well, glowing beneath a sky of stars. That evening, Anselma penned a new entry in the archive. There are wells that hunger, there are wells that whisper, and there are wells that weep. To each we offer not silence but story, not fear but memory. May the earth carry our names in sorrow, not in forgetting. Outside, the first crocus pierced the snow, and beneath the cliffs of Carethmari, the sea stirred gently, no longer in mourning but in remembrance. Part 17. The days following Anselma's return from Carethmari unfolded with an unusual serenity, as if the village of Kalebrook, long burdened by invisible watchfulness, could at last breathe without tension. The snow persisted, blanketing the hills and roofs in silver hush, but its presence no longer felt ominous. Children played once more in the drifts without glancing nervously toward the forest's edge. Lanterns burned late into the evenings, and the chapel bell, though seldom rung, no longer felt like a herald of loss. Yet for Anselma, peace did not come with stillness. The archive grew heavier by the day, not with burden, but with purpose. Each new entry she added became a thread in a tapestry that was slowly revealing its shape, a lattice of memory spanning generations and geographies, connecting each well, each story, each soul. One morning, as frost traced delicate spirals along the chapel windows, a traveler arrived. He came cloaked in a dark mantle, stiff with snow, his boots muddied and worn, and his eyes carrying the far-off look of one who had wandered too long. He gave his name simply, Edric. A scholar, he claimed, from the stone-clad city of Westland to the east, where libraries carved into hillsides housed the oldest texts of the kingdom. He had come seeking Anselma, by name no less, having heard of her work not through rumor, but by written word. "I received a page," he said, unrolling a parchment with careful fingers. "No signature, only this symbol." He pointed to the inked spiral curling around an open eye. Anselma's breath stilled. It was Wulrich's sigil. One she had never sent, but which had clearly made its way into Edric's possession. The page itself was from a book she recognized instantly. It bore a passage from the archive, one she had written after her journey to Thornholt. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In the hands of a blind monk," Edric replied, "at a monastery buried beneath ice. He said it came from the south, carried by wind and time." She knew then that the archive was no longer confined to Sealbrook. It had begun to move, as all living things do when stirred by truth. Perhaps carried by unseen hands, or perhaps drawn by the wells themselves, seeking to remember what had once been lost. Over the coming days, Edric spoke of his own findings. In the southernmost reaches of the realm, near the sun-drenched ruins of Valcliff, there existed a well buried beneath a collapsed temple, a place abandoned after a fire no records explained. But he had found traces, blackened stone, old ash, and carvings near the altar that bore unmistakable spirals. He described voices in the wind and dreams of faces whose mouths moved in silence. Something lingers there, he said. Something that wants to be named. Anselma listened intently. She had begun to understand that each well bore a different face of the same hidden truth. The one beneath Sealbrook was hungry, the one near Carethmar mourned. Others whispered, others remembered, but none were empty. Each was filled with memory, and each had been silenced too long. "We must go," she said, "not to banish it, to listen." Preparations were swift. Word spread among the keepers, and a small group assembled. Edric, with his knowledge of glyphs and tongues. Maigrin, the old widow who remembered songs long before the chapel's bells had first rung, and two others whose families had long served as silent stewards of forgotten lore. Mairin, now 13 and more sensitive than ever, wished to go as well, claiming the dreams had returned, gentle but insistent. But Anselma refused her gently. "Your gift is to remember," she said, brushing a curl from the girl's brow. "Ours is to carry the remembering forward." On the 7th day of the month, as the snow gave way to rain and the roads turned to mud, the group departed, heading southward toward Valcliff. The journey was longer than expected. The land changed as they moved. Forests became thickets of bare olive trees, stone cottages gave way to sandstone ruins, and the chill of northern wind faded into a warm, bone-deep stillness. But the further they traveled, the more dreams came. Maigrin dreamed of ash falling like snow. Edric spoke of music without instruments, echoing from the temple's shadows. And Anselma, night after night, heard a name whispered not in her ears but in her blood, Lunessa. They reached the ruins just after dusk on the 11th day. Valcliff was a skeleton of its former self. Sun-bleached walls half swallowed by the earth, arches broken like ribs. Yet the temple still stood, its upper dome shattered, its floor covered in a thin layer of soot undisturbed by wind or rain. Time had forgotten this place, but something within had not. In the very heart of the temple, beneath an altar blackened by flame, they found it. A well, half choked with stone and ash, but unmistakably present. The spiral was etched faintly into the stone lip, though much had been worn away. It gave no sound, no shimmer. Yet the moment Anselma knelt beside it, the air changed. She closed her eyes and listened, and from below came a voice, dry as dust and slow as memory. "Do you still burn?" She did not flinch. Instead, she opened the archive and whispered, "No, we remember." The silence that followed was not empty. It was reverent. And within the cracked bones of the ruined temple, a wind rose, not from outside, but from the well itself, carrying with it the scent of myrrh and cinders. Something ancient stirred, and far behind them, in the village of Kelbrook, Marin awoke with a start, her eyes wide, her lips trembling with words not yet spoken. "They found her," she said softly. "Lunessa is waking." Part 18. The wind that rose from the well in Valcliff was unlike any breath known to the living. It came not from the sea, nor from any direction the compass might reckon. It swirled gently through the ruined temple, curling like incense through broken arches and shattered stone. It was not cold, not warm, but ancient, imbued with something that defied ordinary touch. As it passed over Anselma and her companions, it brought with it a tremor, not of fear, but of memory. And within that wind, there was a name, not spoken in voice, but carried in the marrow of the silence. Anselma stood still, her eyes shut, her breath held in reverence. The name was not unknown to her, though she had never encountered it in any scroll, nor heard it on any tongue. It existed in the way music lingers after the final note, in the way sorrow breathes beneath joy. The name had always been there, waiting to be remembered. She opened the archive with careful fingers and turned to a blank page. Her pen trembled slightly as she dipped it in ink and wrote the name in full, Lunessa of the Ash Song. The moment the letters dried, the air stilled and the well's shimmer dimmed. Something had been satisfied. "Who is she?" Edric asked from where he stood, a hand resting against a soot-darkened pillar. His eyes were wide, and his voice carried a hint of wonder. and Selma lowered the pen and closed the book. A memory, she said softly, one who chose to endure rather than fade. They made camp within the temple's broken walls, laying their bedrolls in the lee of the altar, where the stone curved like a sheltering wing. Though the air was cold, none among them shivered. The fire they lit crackled quietly, as if mindful not to disturb the place's stillness. They spoke little, each lost in the solemn hush of the place. Magrin, seated on a fragment of a fallen column, drew symbols in the ash with her walking stick. Spirals, crescents, and three-lobed shapes that seemed half-remembered, half-invented. "I was told stories when I was a girl," she murmured. "Old stories from before the church. My grandmother said there were voices in the earth that remembered better than people did. She called them sung places, wells, hollows, groves. She told me of a woman who stayed behind when fire came, a singer of sorrows. I thought it a tale, but this." Edric leaned forward, intrigued. "She sang to the wells?" Magrin nodded. "She didn't command. She didn't bind. She offered. A song not to close the earth, but to soothe it." Anselma gazed into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "Lunessa," she said. "She stayed when the fire came, not to sacrifice, but to sing, to leave her voice behind in the stone. That night, they did not sleep, not from fear, but from the weight of presence. There was something in the temple with them, watching, listening, waiting, not cruel, not lost, only unfinished." Just before dawn, Anselma crept to the well alone. The water within it had grown still again, but it no longer looked lifeless. It shimmered faintly, catching even the absence of light. She knelt beside it, placing her palm gently near the rim, not touching, only sensing. A faint hum stirred against her skin, like the breath of a sleeping child. She began to hum. At first, the tune was uncertain, merely the echo of something half-remembered from dreams. But as the notes spilled from her lips, they took shape. A melody rose, built on aching intervals and soft descents, a lullaby not of peace, but of presence. A song that did not promise safety, but remembrance. Then Magrin joined, her voice rough with age, but rich in texture. Edric followed, chanting in a language none of them fully understood, but all felt. Their harmonies swelled gently, reverently. And the well responded. The water glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with their voices. Then, rising from the depths, not as a figure, but as a sound, came a fourth voice, high, clear, ancient. It wove through their song like a golden thread, lifting the melody into something more. They did not stop. They sang until the light faded and the wind returned, no longer restless but content. Lunessa had answered. When the final note fell away, silence returned, not empty, but full. The well's surface went still again, but the shimmer remained. Something had shifted. A page had turned. They left the temple that morning without ceremony. There were no relics to take, no spells to cast. The song was enough. The telling had been the gift. Anselma, walking at the head of the group, held the archive close to her chest. A new section had been born, and she would ensure it was never lost again. When they returned to Kilbrook, snow still blanketed the fields, though the thaw had begun. The sky had softened to a pewter hue, and smoke curled from every chimney. The village seemed unchanged, yet as Anselma stepped into the square, a hush fell. Faces turned, not in alarm, but in knowing. Marin was already waiting. The girl stood barefoot on the chapel steps, her eyes distant. "She sang to me last night," she said quietly as Anselma approached. "I heard her voice. She said, 'The song is finished. For now.'" Anselma knelt before her, brushing the child's cheek. "Yes," she replied, "and now we must carry it." That evening, by firelight, she inscribed the final lines beneath Lunessa's name. "Some wells weep, some hunger, some whisper, but some sing. And when they sing, we must answer, not with silence, but with song. Let the voice of Lunessa never be lost. Let the melody of the earth be carried by those who remember." And below the village, deep in the stone, the listening continued, not with dread, but with quiet harmony. The song, for now, had been heard. The wind swept low across the moor, bringing with it the moan of something distant and mournful, like the echo of a bell long buried beneath peat and time. In the village of Hallowick, where the hedgerows grew thick with hawthorn and the cottages leaned wearily into the earth, the tale of the night watcher was entering its third generation of quiet dread. To the outsider, it was little more than a fireside fable, another yarn spun by elders eager to impress caution upon the heads of impetuous youth. But for the villagers, and most especially those whose kin had vanished without a trace in years past. The night watcher was neither story nor shadow, but something far worse, something patient. Etta, who now kept the ledgers for the chapel and knew the count of every birth, every death, and every marriage since she was a girl of 10, had taken to sleeping with a candle burning. Her small, lichen-flecked cottage lay on the eastern edge of the village, nearer the wold than most were comfortable with, and though her joints had stiffened with the years, her eyes had never dimmed to the movement beyond her walls. She kept watch, as best she could. Always. When the latest disappearance occurred, a young shepherd boy named Ulrich, no more than 12 winters old, the whispers once again grew louder. His flock had returned without him, hooves muddy and eyes wild, clustering near the outer pastures as if driven by invisible hands. Ulrich's father, Tion, had ridden to the stone circle at dawn, found only a ribbon from the boy's cloak snagged on the rocks, and fallen to his knees. No tracks, no blood, no sound, only the absence where a life had once stirred. A council was held that very evening in the chapel, under the smoke-darkened beams of a roof too old for comfort. Lanterns flickered. Faces drawn tight with age and worry stared at one another, as though hoping someone, anyone, might finally offer a name to the thing that haunted their nights. The priest, Father Elric, whose sermons had grown increasingly burdened by tales of reckoning and divine neglect, stood with trembling hands over the altar. "There is something wrong with the land," he said, voice like brittle parchment. "Not cursed, no, for curses come with cause, but stained, marked by something that feeds not on flesh, but on notice. It waits until we grow too certain, too confident in forgetting, and then it takes." It was not what they wished to hear, yet none could refute the truth of it. In the weeks that followed, new patterns emerged. Ida began marking each night she heard the wind change, that particular whistling lilt that made the shutters shiver and the dogs fall silent. Each of those nights was followed by something unusual. Missing hens, a shattered mirror in a cottage with no sign of forced entry, the vanishing of a tethered goat. Minor, perhaps, but strung together, they formed a garland of unease that no one could quite dismiss. Then came the tracks. Thin, elongated impressions in the frostbitten earth, as if made by something walking on its toes, impossibly light yet precise. Always found near the edge of the village, never deeper within. And yet, it was the bell that caused the most terror. On the first day of the full moon, Ed awoke to the faint chiming of a bell, a sound that no longer belonged to Hallowick. The chapel's bell had been taken down 20 years prior, after a lightning strike split its tower and sent the iron crashing through the roof. It had lain in pieces ever since, rusting and half swallowed by moss. Yet the sound was unmistakable, a slow, mournful tolling, as if summoning the dead to prayer. Others heard it too. Brenna, the widow who tended the graves. Young Martin, who had just learned to carve his father's name into wood. Even the baker's apprentice, who swore on his soul that the sound came not from the ruined tower, but from the moor beyond. By the third night, no one doubted it. A group of 5 men, all of them older and less inclined to superstition, armed themselves and set out before dawn to follow the sound. They returned at dusk, 2 of them white-haired from fear, 1 missing, and none willing to speak of what they saw. Only Eamon, the smith, spoke a single sentence before collapsing into sleep and refusing to wake for 2 full days. "It is not alone." He would say no more. The council met again, this time with more than whispered prayers. They made plans to consecrate the land anew, to dig up the old standing stones and bury them in the river. But when they returned to the stone circle with shovels and rope, they found it altered. The stones had shifted, not fallen, not removed, but turned slightly, subtly, enough to unsettle, as though they had twisted in their slumber to watch. The youngest among them, a lad barely old enough to wield a blade, began to laugh. He laughed until his breath failed him, then dropped to his knees and wept. When asked what he saw, he only said, "It was waiting for us to come. That's all it needed." Ada stopped attending the meetings. She took instead to reading old parish records. The ink faded, but the names still legible. She traced patterns no one else dared to follow, connections between the vanished and the days they disappeared. A rhythm. Not lunar, not seasonal, but something else. A counting, perhaps, a waiting. She wrote letters to distant parishes, to monasteries long disused. She requested old maps, chronicles of minor saints, any account of similar disappearances in villages swallowed by time. One reply came weeks later from a friar in Northumbria. He wrote of a place once called Harlan's Hollow, where the earth hummed on certain nights and children vanished beneath willow roots. A being was rumored there too, tall, silent, with hands too long and eyes too soft. The friar's final words chilled her more than any tale of specters or demons. It does not hunger, it listens. And when it hears its name forgotten, it reminds. That night the wind howled differently. It carried no bell, no footstep, only a single whispered word. Soon. The candle in Ada's window flickered low, its wax pooled and spent, as though worn by the very watch it was meant to keep. Her hands trembled faintly as she scribbled notes into her ledger, the edges of each page grown fragile and thin from overuse. The friar's words looped endlessly through her mind. It listens. A truth, perhaps more than any priest or elder had ever dared admit. Outside, the dusk deepened into a velvety darkness, the sky bruised with the last remnant of sun. No moon shone that night, only the breath of clouds shifting slowly over the hills, and the occasional stir of an unseen wing or paw in the underbrush. The village of Hallowick settled into its nightly hush, a silence born not of peace, but of exhaustion. Fear, after all, was a tireless creature. That evening, another sign appeared, this one more deliberate. In the courtyard near the old granary, a circle had been etched into the earth, not with a plow or tool, but carved cleanly as if by a knife through soft flesh. Around its edge were 6 marks, sharp and narrow, forming a pattern none could decipher. Brenna was the first to see it, and her scream woke the eastern quarter. When the villagers gathered by torchlight, even the most skeptical held their tongues. "What does it mean?" someone asked. Ida crouched low, eyes narrowing as she examined the pattern. She said nothing for a long while. Only when the murmurs became too loud did she rise and whisper, "It is not a warning. It is a message, a herald." They did not ask her to explain. Perhaps none wished to know. That night, sleep eluded the village. Doors were barred, windows fastened tight. The air grew heavy, not with storm or chill, but with an unseen pressure, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing down from every angle. Even the livestock stirred uneasily, horses refusing their stalls, dogs howling into corners where no shadow lay. Just before midnight, a sound rose, a soft, dragging shuffle. It came not from the moors, but from within, from the very heart of the village. Ida, fully clothed and seated by her cold hearth, heard it clearly. She reached for the iron poker beside her and stepped out into the street. The others were already there. Shapes in the dim, hunched, and silent. Not from fear, but from awe. Through the mist walked a figure. Tall, slender, cloaked in what appeared to be a robe of woven dusk. No face was visible, only the suggestion of one, as though seen in the reflection of water. Its hands were clasped before it, fingers impossibly long and unmoving. As it passed, no footfalls sounded, no rustle of fabric, only silence, complete and crushing. It paused at the village well. There it reached out, not to draw water, but to place something on the stone rim. A small bundle, cloth perhaps, or skin. It turned then and walked on, vanishing into the gloom toward the path that led to the stone circle. No one followed. When it was gone, Ada moved to the well. Her breath caught in her throat as she unfurled the bundle. Inside was a single object, a child's tooth, wrapped in a lock of black hair. Beneath that, a folded scrap of parchment. On it, one word, written in an old, cramped hand, remembrance. The council met before dawn. For once, no voices rose in anger or desperation, only quiet resolve. Whatever this was, it was not bound by blade or prayer. It was an old thing, older than their chapel, older than the stones, and it had noticed their forgetting. Ada was the first to suggest it. We must remember, not in silence, not in fear, but fully, truthfully. So it was that they began the work. Stories were told aloud, every vanished name spoken under the open sky. Every mother and father shared the dreams they never dared voice. The baker recounted the day his sister vanished, how the mirror in their home cracked on its own the night before. An old soldier confessed he once saw a shape in the forest that turned the trees to ash in his dreams. And Father Elric, eyes hollow but bright, read aloud from the old scrolls, each passage that warned of the nameless walker. They erected stones, not for the lost, but for the stories themselves, circles of them, carved with the symbols from the granary ground. Ada kept record of it all. Her ledger no longer held only births and deaths, but the spaces in between. The times when the wind changed, when the bells tolled without iron, when something shifted just beyond understanding. And then, without warning, the taking stopped. For a season, then another. No child vanished. No tracks marred the frost. No bells rang. Only the soft sound of a village breathing again. Crops grew. Marriages were held. A child was born in spring, and his naming day was celebrated with a feast that lasted until the stars returned. But Ada knew better than to believe it ended. One night, many months after the last sign, she awoke to find the candle in her window had gone cold. No breeze had touched it, no draft. It had simply stopped. On her sill, where no hand could reach without being seen, was a small stone, smooth, dark, and warm to the touch. No message accompanied it, but it did not need one. Somewhere beyond Hallowick, in the folds of ancient soil and under root-choked stone, the watcher still listened, still waited, for the forgetting to begin anew. Years passed, and the tale of the night watcher softened into murmurs, no longer spoken with the trembling dread it once summoned, but with the reverence afforded to things ancient and ungraspable. In Hallowick, the circle stones remained, their carvings worn by rain and wind, yet still legible to those who remembered. Children played near them, though never within. Parents watched carefully, but no longer with terror, only with a respectful caution, like one would show a storm that had not yet returned. Ida aged slowly, her steps more careful, her hands less steady, but her mind sharp and unwavering. Her ledger had become more than parchment and ink. It was a vault, a memory kept alive, with every line drawn and every tale preserved. She read it often, especially on nights when the mist gathered thick over the thatched roofs, when the owls fell quiet and the woods whispered to themselves. Then, one harvest moon, larger than usual, ruddy as a blood apple, an unfamiliar face appeared in Hallowick. A traveler, cloaked in russet and bearing a satchel of scrolls, arrived on foot just before dusk. He introduced himself as Leoric, a chronicler from the Abbey of Caldriath, which lay far beyond the northern hills, across lands most villagers knew only by name. He was soft-spoken and polite, with a way of looking not at people, but through them. "I've come," he said, "to study your stones." The village, long wary of outsiders with questions, received him with guarded courtesy. Yet something in Leoric's bearing suggested he was not merely curious, but compelled, drawn not by the tale itself, but by its rhythm, the pattern beneath the words. Ada met with him that evening in the chapel, where he examined her records with a kind of hungry reverence, as though each letter might unlock a truth he had chased all his life. "You see it too," he whispered, tracing the spiral pattern etched into one of the copied stone symbols. "The recursion, the way it coils back on itself." She nodded, and for the first time in years, felt less alone in her knowing. Leoric stayed for 7 nights. By day, he walked the moors and sketched the stones. By night, he asked questions, not about the vanishings directly, but about the silences in between. The subtle shifts, the way shadows behaved on certain dates, how birds flew in strange formations before dawn. He was not seeking horror, but harmony, an understanding of the old rhythm. On the 8th day, Leoric disappeared. His satchel was found near the stones, laid carefully beside a patch of flattened grass. Inside were his drawings, notes, and a final unfinished letter addressed not to Ada, but to an unnamed brother monk. It ended mid-sentence, and if the pattern continues, then the next alignment will occur. Nothing more. The village searched, but not deeply. A quiet understanding passed between them. Whatever had drawn Leoric here had also taken him, and perhaps that was always its intent. The circle had not forgotten, and neither could they. Ida added his name to the ledger, not under births or deaths, but in a new section she called Return to the Silence. There, alongside Ulrich, the shepherd boy, and the others whose bodies were never found, Leoric's name sat beneath a single entry date with a note. He walked willingly. But with his passing came something else. That winter, dreams began to stir. Not the usual mutterings of sleep, but shared dreams, consistent visions. Villagers, young and old, began to speak of a pale tree growing from black soil. Always the same image, a single tree, its roots coiled around a dark stone, its branches reaching toward a sky without stars. In the dream, the tree wept, not with tears, but with light. Ada too dreamed. But her vision went further. She saw the Watcher, not walking, not shrouded, but seated beside the tree, hands folded, head bowed, as though waiting still, as though the dreaming itself was a new threshold it had found, a new way to reach those who still clung to remembrance. And in her dream it spoke, not in words but in understanding. The Watcher had never been a taker by nature, but by necessity. Not a punisher, but a memory keeper. It did not demand offerings. It was the offering. A relic of something older than gods, a sentinel of silence, born from the moment humanity first forgot its promises to the dark. When people ceased to sing to the earth, ceased to mark the wind with reverence, something had to remember in their place. Ada woke with tears on her cheeks, not of fear, but of grief. The next morning she did something no one had dared in decades. She walked to the circle and stepped inside. The stones did not hum. The air did not tighten. She stood there, palms open, eyes closed, and she spoke aloud every name in her ledger, one by one with pauses between like a prayer, not of pleading, but of acknowledgement, a roll call of the forgotten. When she finished, the wind picked up. It swept around her in a slow spiral like fingers brushing away cobwebs. And then peace, true and deep. From that day forward, the stones were no longer feared. They were honored. Children were brought to them each year on the eve of winter, not to play, but to listen. Elders would tell stories, not warnings, but truths, of what once was, of what still watched, of the need to remember. Etta passed in her sleep 5 winters later, a soft smile on her lips, her ledger clasped in her arms like a child. On her grave, beside a small carving of the spiral symbol, the villagers placed a stone, not to ward, but to witness. It bore one word, chiseled with care. Remembrance, the seasons, as ever, came and went with a hush that blanketed Halloween in rhythms so gentle, even the birds seemed to sing more softly. With the passing of years, the great fear that had once ruled the hearts of villagers faded not into absence, but into reverence, a quiet, steady honoring of something they no longer sought to understand, only to remember. The Night Watcher was no longer spoken of as a monster. Its name, once cloaked in tremors and hurried whispers, now echoed in slow, deliberate tones, preserved in ceremony and carved in stone. Children no longer feared the stones at the edge of the moor. They bowed to them, placing wildflowers and acorns at their feet before running off to play. Elders stood in silence by the circle, hands clasped not in desperation, but in gratitude. Something had changed. Not vanished, not defeated, but transformed. Each autumn, when the air grew sharp and the first frost kissed the leaves, the villagers held a vigil known simply as the Night of Names. It was not a festival. There was no music, no dancing, no laughter. Only silence, and the gentle glow of hundreds of small candles, each flame flickering in the wind like the memory of a breath long exhaled. These candles were set into a great spiral on the village green, mirroring the ancient symbol found at the granary and the stones. Each flame represented a soul, some known, others unnamed, offered not as appeasement, but as acknowledgement. No longer did they wait for signs of doom. No more tracks in the snow, no more bells from nowhere, no more long shadows. But in place of these, something quieter remained. Dreams, soft dreams, shared by many, of a single pale tree growing in dark soil, its bark the color of ash, its branches outstretched beneath a sky with no stars. Some saw the tree shedding light, others saw it bearing small glass fruits filled with mist. Yet all felt peace upon waking, a gentle reminder that something beyond had not abandoned them. The chronicler's work passed from Eda's careful hands to those of Lynn, a girl once stirred from her sleep by the sound of the tree weeping in her dreams. She had grown under the Watcher's long shadow, not as a child of fear, but of understanding. Her voice was quiet, her eyes always searching the horizon, and she never wrote in haste. To Lynn, memory was sacred, and the act of recording it a kind of worship. She took Ada's aged ledger and began anew, a second volume bound in black woolen cloth, its spine hand-stitched with twine. She named it The Ledger of Stillness. Within it, she chronicled more than disappearances or strange occurrences. She recorded every story told during the Night of Names. She drew the spiral again and again. She noted every flower that bloomed at the stone's base, every dream a child whispered to her in secret, every night when the wind changed direction without warning. The village had become her scripture, and the Watcher its sacred text. Over time, Halloween became known beyond its quiet borders. Pilgrims came, first from nearby hamlets, then from further afield, not out of fear or thrill, but in search of wisdom. They had heard of a place where silence was honored and the forgotten were remembered. Some came with questions, others with grief, and a few with nothing at all but the hope of hearing something only the quiet could speak. They walked the spiral of candles. They left tokens at the stones, and always they sat in stillness beneath the tree. For the tree had come. One spring, decades after Ida's last vigil, a sapling sprouted near the northern edge of the village, where no tree had ever taken root. It was pale as bone, its bark shot through with threads of silver. Its branches reached in odd, graceful arcs, and its leaves shimmered not green, but soft gray-blue, like the underside of a crow's wing. No one planted it, no one touched it, yet it grew, quickly, silently, as though it had always been there, waiting to be seen. The villagers named it the Remembrance Tree. It became a place of stillness, not of worship, but of listening. Children sat beneath it in silence and returned with dreams not their own, memories of faces, voices, fragments of songs they'd never heard before. Some wept, some smiled, none spoke right away. And then, one autumn, something new arrived. A stranger came to Halloween at twilight. He was tall, cloaked in wool dyed the color of dusk, and he walked with a staff carved in spirals. No name did he give, only a request to see the ledger. Lynn, now old herself, handed it to him without question. He sat beneath the remembrance tree, pages spread before him, and read until the stars came out. His eyes moved like wind over water, gentle, sure, and constant. At last, he closed the book, returned it to Lynn, and placed a single hand against the bark of the tree. "It sings now," he said, his voice like the hush of snow. "You've remembered well." He left before dawn. No one saw where he went. But in the spot where he had sat, a small stone remained, flat and smooth, carved with the spiral and the word, kept. The watcher, it seemed, no longer needed to show itself. Its work was not to be seen, but to be felt. Not to take, but to ensure that the taking would never again be born from silence. And Halloween endured. Not because it was untouched, but because it had remembered. The village remained small, modest. No great towers or monuments, just low stone walls mocked a chapel forever crumbling but lovingly swept, and fields sown with hands that knew their soil. It was not grand, but it was steady. And in that steadiness, something ancient found rest. To this day, the spiral is drawn anew each year. The candles are lit and the names are read. The children still sit beneath the remembrance tree, and in their dreams they hear the wind say a single word again and again. Not a warning, not a threat, just a whisper. Still.